morning to everybody, and welcome everyone. And thanks for being a part of a special morning session on Saturday. I promise that it would be a riveting one. I have the pleasure and privilege to introduce Maruf Raza, author, strategic affairs expert, and well known broadcaster. Uh, Welcome, sir.
Thank you.
Maruf Raza has been a former Indian Army officer, educated in India and England, is now a well-known media commentator on global military and security issues. He's currently a consulting editor with Times TV network, where he hosts award-winning shows like Line of Duty and Tales of Valor. Maruf Raza's areas of interest include the Kashmir issue, Sino-Indian relations, and India's insurgencies. His published books include, among others, Kashmir's Untold Story, co-authored with another well-known author, Iqbal Malhotra, and a book in Hindi, Shaurya Gatha, Bharat Ke Veer Senani, co-authored with Colonel Shivdan Singh. There is, before we jump into the discussion, I'll lay out the format. We'll have, thoughts from Maruf Raza of the next half hour, after which I will engage in a Q&A with him. And if there is time, we will invite questions from the audience. There are a bit about the book. There are books that are written, there are books that are read, and then there are books that are consumed. Contested Lands, I have it right here before me. I urge everyone to go and read the book, because this is a wholesome body of work. It takes the reader through the journey, the genesis of India-China conflict, the journey, the trajectory, the impact, and the potentiality. All of this in 200 plus pages. There have been several books written on India and China, but this is one book that you must read if you would like to understand where we stand today and how we have arrived at where we are. A book for historians, strategic affairs analysts, regular readers alike. What you read in the media has roots in history, has roots in what happened in the 50s and 60s and thereafter. What you see in the media, the confrontation, the various alignments or the collusion between the various stakeholders is an outcome of several aspects that are being mentioned and articulated so very well in the book. It delivers a comprehensive narrative of disputes between the two countries. It's logical, lucid, and as I would have expected, Maruf Raza's style, he cuts through the rather complex narrative of India-China issues and presents a very readable book. Contested Lands is incontestably a brilliant read. I urge you to go and read that. The book, before and without much ado, I would now hand over to Maruf Raza for the next half hour. Please welcome, sir.
Good morning, everybody. Thank you very much. I'm extremely grateful to Captain Prabal Das Gupta, or was it Major, for the very, very kind introduction. Both of us are ex-infantrymen, so it's an advantage that we have had when we look at issues concerning our neighbors, where at the end of the day, as there is an old saying, the last 200 yards of victory have to be measured on foot. And that the good old infantryman does, and he's the one who plants your flag there. So for us, understanding the ground realities and not sticking to the larger academic issues, what I've brought to the table, as Prabal has brought to your notice, is a combination of understanding of history and the practicalities of getting it done on the ground. So what is the problem? The book came about essentially during COVID times. It took me about 6-7 months to write it. A lot of people believe that that was rather quick for a book of this nature. But I would admit it is many years of study of China also that became a distilled document in this book. I wrote it when Galwan happened, and thereafter there were questions being raised by so many people that problem kya hai? And there are no easy solutions, but it's easy to understand the problem. And therefore, I went into a certain point. Now, people may argue that the roots of Sino-Indian boundary claims, and essentially it's about boundary disputes, lie in the 16th century. I would argue, there needs to be, as a historian, there needs to be a start point and there needs to be an end point. You cannot go into infinity and say, ki, we were great civilizations, why are we having a problem? And if you cut to the present, then you begin to ask and answer questions. Currently, the Ukraine issue has also put India into a bit of a dilemma, because if India goes along with old friend Russia and approves what it has done in Ukraine, tomorrow India's stand on expansionism on our borders will be questioned by many others, that if you approve what Russia has done militarily, why do you have a problem with what China has done with you in 2020 and actually from the 1950s onwards? Why 1950s? And this is what I'll now take a few minutes to explain. You see, India-China relations are partly complex because our people at the top haven't bothered to study it. They have found evasive tactics to deal with China. Oh, we've put it on the back burner. We are now onto a bulletless border and we are managing our relations without firing each other. So, when time will come, we'll settle it. China can wait infinitely, can we? Secondly, the issue is about our policymakers being willing to take some harsh decisions. You don't settle any dispute. Firstly, Mr. Arun Singh once taught me an interesting approach. He says you don't have a dispute unless you have 2 points of view. And if there are 2 points of view, then you have to understand the other person's point of view to come to some kind of a agreed compromise or agreement. Some people are allergic to the word compromise, but whichever way you look at it, you have to stop eyeballing or punching at each other and come to some kind of a compromise. And this requires a certain give and take. And that requires a tall political leadership that is willing to give and take and willing to then accept that what are we insisting on keeping and what is China insisting on keeping. Now, before I go into the historical reasons why China is citing its claims on Aksai Chin, and the book is not just about Aksai Chin, it is also very much about the dispute over McMahon Line. McMahon Line is the one that divides now China-occupied Tibet from Arunachal Pradesh, and the real major route our military faced in 1962 was on the McMahon Line. In fact, Prabhal's book about Nathula is again about that part of India and not so much about Aksai Chin, where we were able to establish our own stand and convey a very strong message to China that the lessons of 62 have been learned. Now, China's claims on Aksai Chin are twofold, like Pakistan's claims on Kashmir. Pakistan might argue that Kashmir should be a part of Pakistan because that was what was promised as part of the partition agreement, and also because Kashmir was a Muslim majority state, so it should go to Pakistan. But that argument fell flat on the ground when it became known that Pakistan was also hankering for the waters of Kashmir and not the people of Kashmir. The sooner the people of Kashmir understand that reality, the lesser they will be those chants for independence. As far as Aksai Chin is concerned, so we can look at the map, and when you look at the map, you will find that on the right of India's map, on the top right, is the area Aksai Chin. And this area is of immense value to China, not just more recently, but it has always been of value to China, even at the time of our independence. And even before independence, the Russians were interested in that area because the Aksai Chin area is a huge resource-rich area which has uranium reserves. The Russians were excavating uranium from there and shifting it north of India, north of POK, towards the southern part of Central Asia, which is on top of Afghanistan. There was a place called Semipalatinsk. And that's where the Russians had their nuclear plants. And that's where the Russians eventually did the first nuclear test, 56. Now, no, not 56, 49. But the point is that Russia and China started engaging very closely after Mao Zedong came to power in 49. And Mao saw that the importance of China in the world will only come when China has nuclear weapons. And therefore, to make nuclear weapons, you needed a nuclear plant and you needed mineral resources like uranium. And that is what was available in Aksai Chin. So that was one thing that was on Mao's agenda from the very beginning. The second thing was that the water resources that come from Aksai Chin, especially when you look at the Aksai Chin lake catchment area, there is a lot of water resources there that come. The Indus River systems is one of them, and the Karakash River and others. So the Chinese wanted to control the waters. And therefore, even now, the Chinese holding on to Aksai Chin is, as you see the map now, you will see on the map, there is Aksai Chin on the top near Ladakh. And there is the McMahon line, which is above Arunachal Pradesh near Bhutan. Now, these are the two lines that are the lines of major contestation. And at least one US analyst, Bruce Riedel, who's written books extensively on Pakistan and geostrategy, has been advisor to 3-4 US presidents, has been on record to say that any further escalation of conflict between India and China in this region could also be the start of a world war. Now, whether Ukraine could be the start of a world war or could this lead to a full-fledged conflict which countries may get involved or not involved, but he has made that assumption. I don't go along with it entirely, but that's an assumption. Then the Chinese decided to steadily occupy this. Why they occupied the Aksai Chin area was because there was very little Indian presence there. And this was only highlighted much later in 1956 or thereabouts by an officer from Prabol's regiment, Captain later General Rajendranath, who was my commandant at the IMA Dehradun, that there was a Chinese presence there. But this report was again subdued or put aside like the Henderson-Brooks report. And the other was a number of flights that were taken up by a person called Wing Commander Jagginath. He was a younger officer in the pre-62 days. He got a Mahavir Chakra for 62 and then got again a Mahavir Chakra for 1965 war. And he took massive amount of photographs all along this line, which again proved that China was building up massive presence there. So when the news hit Panditji in the public domain and questions began to be asked in the mid-50s in Parliament, I think 56, 58, then, you can't lie to Parliament. So Panditji was in a spot and Panditji said that, first there were arguments put across that why do we need to defend a territory where not a blade of grass grows? And there was a snide remark by another MP to say, if not a blade of hair grows on your head, will you not defend your head? But later on, this became a confrontational point between Panditji and the then Army Chief General Maya. So where was the problem? The problem in the first instance was because there was a lack of understanding in India, and China exploited that lack of understanding about the lines that really spelt out the area of Aksai Chin. Now, as you saw in the map, the outermost hook of Aksai Chin, that area which is the boundary of the yellowish or yellow ochre area, area which has been covered as Aksai Chin. Now, that was a boundary line drawn by an Anglo-Indian surveyor. His name was Mr. Johnson. Now, Johnson had a problem with how the British white man treated him. He was neither here nor there. And the Maharaja then of Kashmir, Pratap Singh, decided to exploit this grievance inside Mr. Johnson. So he told him, he says, since you are marking out the boundary and there was nobody else going to mark out the boundary, he says, kindly stretch it as far as you can. So if you stretch it that far, then I can lay claim to all that territory and my empire becomes bigger and bigger. And Johnson was promised apparently a deal after retirement in the Maharaja's kingdom. So that's what came out is the Johnson line, which is in the outer periphery of Aksai Chin. Is just for representation purposes, but roughly it's like this, which was the outer periphery for some time. Many, including the Maharaja, claimed, but the British were not happy by the Maharaja extending his writ without the British permission, because the British were actually controlling the Maharaja like a child. You know, they had a protectorate in Kashmir. Then subsequently, the British then came about with what came to be known as, so this was 1866. And then the British came up with another line called the Ardak-Johnson line. There was a guy called General Johnson, Ardak. And General Ardak was the director of military intelligence. So he kind of drew a line which would address British concerns more, because you see, at that time, the British were dealing with Russians' intrusions into northern parts of J&K, parts of Tibet, parts of Wakhan Corridor, Afghanistan, etc. And the British were in a dilemma that if they confronted the Russian Empire, then Queen Victoria then was the aunt or cousin of the Russian Tsar. So there were family ties at that level, and the British Empire didn't want to go into war with the Russian Empire. So they were trying to draw a line by jahan tak at the outside the Russians have reached. Let's kind of define that, okay, you stay there and this is the British Empire. You know, the lines were all part of empire boundary making. And then came about another line called, and this was a line that was defined later as the Ardak-Johnson line, and then came about a line called the Macartney line. Now, this Macartney line, Mr. Macartney was the British Consul General in Kashgar. Kashgar is north of Kashmir in Sinkiang. And right now, the highway that runs through Aksai Chin, called Highway 219, G219, that is the main connecting communication road for China between Sinkiang and Tibet, two regions that the Chinese are very, very wary of. Sinkiang, as you know, there is resentment against Chinese control of the Uyghur Muslims. In Tibet, there is resentment against Chinese control of the Tibetan Buddhists. And so, therefore, there is this highway that gives China massive connectivity. It's like the Grand Trunk Road, sort of. This passes through Aksai Chin. So, eventually, there came a situation that the Chinese first published an atlas between 1917 and 1933, and it accepted the outside boundaries of the Johnson line. And the Johnson line was the original line which gave that massive hook to Aksai Chin. Then later on, when the Chinese regime came into power, that is the communist regime, it dismissed everything that was announced by the Chinese Empire earlier. And the Chinese Empire had gone through stages of strong points and weak points. And then they said that we will accept the Macartney-McDonnell line as the claim line, which ran halfway between Johnson line and Ladakh's Aksai Chin. It was halfway. It ran around the Kunlun mountain ranges, which runs halfway through. So there was a lot of debate to and fro in India that what should we accept as China's position. Now, let's go back a little more in history. That the British were very keen to define the outer boundaries of Tibet way back in 1900. That was 50 years before China made all these claims. Why? Because Tibet was an important country then. China, in some attempts to conquer Tibet, had got a thrashing. And funnily, Chinese troops went back to China via Calcutta by the seaport. So they came down from Tibet via the Jamperi range, Siliguri and those areas, and then went to Calcutta and took a ship. So, it was not a hard and fast rule those days that you can't step into my territory and I can't step in. I mean, there were British expeditions that went into Tibet under Lieutenant Colonel Younghusband, and they went back to Delhi, and Delhi told London that Tibet is very important. It has a cultural thing. It has a resource importance to India, etc., etc. But what Mao and others were looking at Tibet much later was Tibet was the source of waters for Asia. Indus came from Tibet. The Brahmaputra came from Tibet. The Mekong River in Southeast Asia came from Tibet. Tibet had a lot of natural resources. It had even apparently other precious metals and uranium. So for Mao, Tibet was much more than just another territory. So in 1913-14, the British Viceroy in India convened a meeting over the boundaries of Tibet. And this meeting was spearheaded by a guy called Lieutenant Colonel Sir Francis McMahon. McMahon was a hardcore imperial subcontinental man, as somebody said, burnt in the furnace of South Asia or the subcontinent. He was a tough soldier, scholar, diplomat. He had earlier defined what is now a point of dispute between Pakistan and Afghanistan called the Durand Line. So he was asked to convene this conference. Now, he was quite optimistic he'd get something out of it. And several rounds of discussion took place. The Chinese representative who came from the very beginning was dragging his feet. Two reasons. One was that China had tried to capture Tibet around 1912 and had got a thrashing. And other than that, China claimed all of Tibet. The British were trying to work out an outer region of influence and an inner region. So the inner region, if you look, map please, if you look at the map and you see Tibet, the areas closer to Lhasa and the central part of the Tibetan plateau was to be part of the inner region. And the outer part of the Tibetan plateau, which went much closer to Shanghai, Beijing, and even towards Mongolia, was meant to be area of Chinese influence. Now, they were trying to settle a deal there, but the problem was the southern part of Tibet. That is the boundaries touching Ladakh, Nepal, Bhutan, Arunachal Pradesh and all. They needed to define that. Now, Nepal's boundary with Tibet was already defined. And so was Bhutan's boundary, though China and Bhutan still have disagreements over which part of territory should go to grazing land to China and which other way around. But it was this large chunk called in those days, the frontiers, later became NIFA, later became Arunachal Pradesh. That needed to be defined. So many meetings between Delhi and Shimla that took place because of changing weather finally led to no answers. And Sir Henry McMahon, in frustration, pulled out a map, whatever he could lay his hands on. And this was not a metric map. As soldiers would know, a metric map defines an area in much greater detail. But a quarter-inch map defines an area very narrowly. So, in a quarter-inch map, you'll find the entire city in one roundel, like you have seen Ladakh in one roundel. You see, Nepal and all is given like this. But in a metric map, it is much bigger and more details are brought in. Hills, ranges, watershed lines, rivers, everything is more clearly visible in a metric map. But with much ceremony and not to be embarrassed that the conference was going to collapse completely after almost 6-8 months of Shimla and Delhi toing and froing, Mr. McMahon drew a thick line with a thick pen, what came to be known as the McMahon line. Now, that line, when you interpret it on the ground, and Prabal will be able to explain it better than I, that line could be a kilometer broad or more, because a thick pen line on a metric map is nowhere close, on a quarter-inch map is nowhere close to what a thick line might mean in a metric map, which is, it will actually go along a river or a nala or watershed or whatever. But here, it takes everything into place. And so today also we have this disagreement that the Chinese are building camps on our part of the territory and they are, and this is our perception of the line and this is their perception. So having explained all this to you, I would like to sum up to say that while the McMahon line became at least something demarcated, and Pandit Nehru was on record to say that as far as I'm concerned, this is our border on that side and it is settled. China sometimes was willing to admit it, sometimes was not willing to admit it. But it is Tibet and its fate and its adjoining areas of Aksai Chin and Ladakh that was left unsettled then, 1913-14, unsettled much later in 1917 to 33 because of the Chinese map showing something and our maps claiming. And in fact, the Chinese maps then went along with our claim line of the Johnson line. And much later, then the new Chinese regime comes and claims an area which is closer to our territory. And this is where the punching matches have recently taken place, somewhere close to that, along the Shiok River and all that what became. So these were the two defining positions. Then we slipped into this whole appeasement era of the Chinese, which Panditji adopted, that we are two new countries. So let us have a new friendly relationship. And one of the blunders that was made then was that the Panchsheel Treaty, which in itself was not a bad idea, but the Panchsheel Treaty in its title says Tibet region of China. So that means as a nation, you acknowledge that. But at the same time, Panditji published maps of India, which have been more recently published again of the various types by the BJP government. And they showed the entire region of Aksai Chin as belonging to India, which is what the Chinese maps had earlier said up till 1933. But China was disputing that when Mao and his communists came into power. So there was that one problem. So China was upset with the new maps. While you're giving a sort of accommodative treaty to the Chinese to do whatever they wanted in Tibet, and we started removing some of our trading posts also from there. So our listening post, our watch post, everything was very quickly removed from there. And Tibet was de facto allowed to become Chinese territory. We did not pass or stand up for a single resolution against Chinese occupation of Tibet around 1952 and thereabouts. So Mongolia stood up, a small country with a border with China. Ecuador stood up, but we kept quiet. So China knew that Nehru's weak spot was that he didn't want to anger the Chinese. Also, Panditji was very taken in with his idea of non-alignment. He says, Mahatma Gandhi has become world famous with non-cooperation. I should become famous with non-alignment. So the Americans were keen for India to become part of the American camp. But Panditji refused, saying that we are non-aligned. So we were looking at Soviet 5-year growth plans and 5-year models of growth. We were looking at America to be a friend by our side because we were democracies, but we were not really on anybody's side. And we paid heavily for it in the 62 conflict. 3-4 things got China's backup before 62. Officially, the map-making process, the claims that McMahon line is our border, and I don't want to discuss it further. The map claims over Aksai Chin, which got the Chinese backup. The ongoing engagement between India and the US, because America's Secretary of State, Dean Acheson onwards, had started using India as a launchpad to engage with the Tibetans. And the Chinese then and now have been very sensitive to the Tibetans engaging with the outside world. Dalai Lama's, one of his brothers lived in San Francisco. Another brother of his would be in the US and come back and become an engaging point in Kalimpong, Darjeeling, in those areas with Tibetan lamas who would go back to Lhasa and carry the message. And it is believed that when Dalai Lama finally escaped to India in March 1959, the CIA orchestrated his entire release. But before that, the CIA had been arming and training and even airdropping Tibetan commandos into Tibet to play hell with parts of Chinese army floating around in the vast open deserts of Tibet. These are known as Gompa rebels. And Chinese were very upset by India becoming the launch pad for many operations against China in Tibet. So the US factor played on China's mind while we kept saying we don't want to be part of the US alliance. Finally, air photographs that were brought in by Wing Commander Jagginath, it showed very clearly that China had been building nuclear facilities in Loknor, which if you look in the map is just up on top of Nepal, and in Loknor, they didn't want their facilities to be deciphered and messaged to go back to America, which will obviously would have stopped China from becoming a nuclear power. This is the kind of thing Israel does whenever it finds any Arab country is making nuclear weapons, or it has a reactor like Iraq had in 1982, then Israel goes and bombs it. So China did not want that nuclear plot of theirs to be exposed. Now, what was happening is the photographs that came to Delhi were being passed on to British intelligence because Delhi had an open link with British intelligence through the 50s. Every day, a report and a briefing went to an MI officer in Delhi by IB. Those photographs were passed on to London and also to Washington. But in London, sitting as the head of British external intelligence was a person called Kim Philby. Kim Philby was a Russian spy. He was passing it back to Russia. Russia was telling the Chinese, what the hell are you doing? They are getting to know that you are making this nuclear reactor. So Mao was in a desperate hurry to keep India off his back. So after repeated attempts to try and convey to India that get off our backs, India adopted various policies which were beginning to upset the Chinese. One was the so-called forward policy. It has later been argued by Mr. K. Subramaniam, the father of the current foreign minister, S. Jaishankar, that the forward policy was only a lookout post to see what China was doing on the other side. But we were putting across very thinly armed groups of 5-6 men, inadequately equipped for the winter, inadequately armed for a Chinese patrol to come and knock them off. And they were meant to be lookout posts. Chinese saw those as Indian military intrusions into Chinese territory. And the second thing was that with no understanding of the ground reality, Pandit Nehru had appointed a man who the army abhors, Lieutenant General B.G. Kaul, who was a logistics man, had no concept of how fighting is done in the mountains, and had exposure to military units and all, like everybody in the military has. But to command troops, you have to grow up with the troops and have to understand the ground. So he was made overall in charge of our sector in the Northeast, that is the NIFA sector. A 4 corps was created for his pleasure. And the 33 corps, where General Umrao Singh stood up to Panditji and all, was sidestepped into Siliguri and said, you quietly sit there. So B.G. Kaul continued to create a view in Delhi that we can handle the Chinese, there's no cause for worry. Krishna Menon loved to hear all that because he was Krishna Menon's pick. General Thapar, Karan Thapar's father, took a back seat and chose to remain quiet as army chief. He succeeded the much admired General Thimaiya, but Thimaiya had confronted Nehru over the announcement that I've asked the army to throw the Chinese out. Thimaiya said, at least speak to me before you announce that the army will throw the Chinese out. We are not equipped, we are not adequately positioned to throw the Chinese out. But us confrontation mein Thimaiya had resigned. Nehru, in a personal conversation with him, asked him to take the resignation back. Next day announced in parliament that I've ordered the army chief to take his resignation back. So Thimaiya thereafter became a lame duck chief. I believe Thimaiya should have still resigned and walked out. But Thimaiya stayed on, and this gave ground to Nehru, Krishna Menon and others to create a mindset in South Block that our writ runs on military issues. Various things came up, including the Government of India Rules of Business of 1961, which thereafter said that in future, India's security will be handled by the Defense Secretary of India, not the service chief. So till date, if we get attacked by China, Pakistan or anybody, it's not the service chiefs who will respond. It is the Defense Secretary who will have to sign a letter to him, as Mr. H.C. Sareen had then done, and give it to them, ki please fight the Chinese or the Pakistanis. I mean, that is the shoddy state we are still in. Anyway, so B.G. Kaul created this climate of great belief that we will take on the Chinese. On the other hand, there was other general officers who were all going along with the Krishna Menon Nehru line that China will not attack us. If they can, Nehru even once said, I have the police, we can throw the Chinese off. But there was General Thapar, there was General Bhullar, who later acquitted himself well in the 65 war. There was General Dhillon, sorry. There was Monty Palhe, the Gurkha officer, who later wrote his own explanation on the war in the high Himalayas. But he was DMO and his inputs were not heard. In many cases, he went along with General Thapar. There was General L.P. Sen, Eastern Army Commander, who was overall responsible for our Eastern sector. Again, a brave soldier, DSO from World War II, but he stood back and let himself be ruled over. So we had a situation that the Indian Army on the ground was receiving commands from people who didn't know what the ground looked like. The Indian Army troops were ill-equipped. They were not provided clothing and weapon systems to fight a Chinese attack. And they were positioned in ridiculous places along nalas and rivers where troops are never put in defense when you have to defend a territory. You have to defend it from a high ground. Enemy will come rolling down onto your nala and river. And that's what happened on the first night of 20th October 1962, that the Chinese rolled down at River Namkachu and 2nd Rajput, the brave battalion, was almost wiped out. More than 500 casualties in one night, more than we lost in the entire Kargil conflict. So just to give you a context. Secondly, other troops were also given conflicting orders. Some days they were asked to hold on, some days they were asked to withdraw. And that is how the fall of Tawang took place. There was complete confusion. First orders were given for withdrawal. When they started withdrawing, then they said, go back and take your position. By then the Chinese were coming in. So there was a right royal mess and a rout took place. Luckily for us, General Daulat Singh and General Bikram Singh, who were holding the front on the Ladakh front, were solid soldiers. They didn't listen to Delhi. And like General Sagat Singh in the 1967 Sino-Indian Nathula conflict, he cut off the telephone lines from Delhi and he said, let me bloody well handle it. And that's what these guys did. I still get messages from General Daulat Singh's son, who's in Australia, and saying, you've written a book that I should have written. My father told me everything and it's all in your book. How did you get it? But he said they held the line. And there are famous stories of battle from 62, the Battle of Rizangla, which is still studied by the Pakistan Army as the finest act of defiance and defense. And they all died, except for 2 people who were heavily wounded. They crawled back and in their blood, they were lying and the Chinese gave them up as dead. They're still there in Rewari near Gurgaon to tell us the story. And I recorded that in my series Tales of Valor. The rest of them under Major Shaitan Singh, I don't know what his parents thought when he gave him the name, but the name was apt. He really, for the Chinese, was the devil. He and his 110 men died to the last man. And he got a Paramvir Chakra, rightly so, but many fierce battles were fought. There was a Ladakhi chap, for 6 months, he was alone in a bunker in DBO, thinking DBO is the famous airfield that we now have, which allows us to hold off the Chinese when the Chinese are intruding into Depsang Plains and Siachen. He held on to this for 6 months alone with a little sigdi and some rations, thinking Indian troops will come. And he kept every day hoisting the Indian flag there at DBO. His story is there in Kunal Verma's book, 1962, The War That Wasn't. I have covered it in my TV episodes also. So these were the kind of Indian soldiers. And look at the leadership we had. Whatever justification people gave for Pandit Nehru and his brilliance and whatever else, Pandit Nehru was a good administrator, should have stuck to that. He tried to become a statesman and a foreign policy mandarin. He failed us. So the Chinese taught us this lesson that Mao wanted to teach us a lesson to basically get us off his back and our probing eyes. And in the 1 month, he attacked us, he went back to his old claim lines, which is the 1959-60 claim line around Aksai Chin, which even now when the Galwan standoff took place, the Chinese premier and the foreign minister again sounded that 59-60 line. In between, on several occasions, they've said, we will keep Aksai Chin, you keep Ladakh. we will keep Aksai Chin, you keep Nifa or Arunachal. वहां भी हमारी हिम्मत नहीं हुई to take a stand because तो we have said कि हमारा तो अखंड भारत होना चाहिए. Then वही नहीं. We should even go out and get POK and we should get everything else. Where are your resources? You don't have the money, you don't have the resources, and you think, the Chinese and the Pakistanis are Burma and Sri Lanka that you can just walk in and knock them over. I mean, you'll have a problem on your hand that you itself, as I say to various people, I say, जो आपके पास है वो तो नहीं संभल रहा, आप वहां का लेने चल रहे. So we have to get a little real that what is it that we can live with and we can make it a prosperous India and a great India. Just by acquiring territory, you don't become great. Israel became an independent country about our time, 1948. The world sees it as a heavyweight. Singapore is the size of Delhi. The world sees it as a heavyweight. The world still sees India as a country in waiting, a great power in waiting. Why? Because we are overstretched. And if we are overstretched, we have to put resources in place to at least have in good control what we have. So the book brings that out. The book also brings out the fact that we could have altered the story in the 62 conflict had we used our Air Force. We had better capable aircrafts, we had better pilots, and our flights were flying from the plane so they could fly with full fuel and payloads. But we were scared that if the Chinese are upset, they will use the Air Force. Or kitna upset karna tha? Hundreds of soldiers had already died. You were still scared of hitting them. And the biggest culprit of the 62 conflict, who I have not mentioned as yet, was Panditji's advisor, Bholanath Malik. He created a situation where he got CRPF people ambushed in the, what is that name? Kongpa ambush. He got them done. What is it? I think it's Kongpa. So he got them ambushed to create a fear that, don't confront the Chinese. He said with Menon and others and got the air chief APSI engineer to go in line with them that we should not use Air Force. And the American ambassador then was happily smiling, John Galbraith, when Panditji wrote 2 letters to Kennedy on the same day. You provide us Air Force. Kennedy's response was, first use yours. And why China attacked us in 62 between 20th October and 1920 November was the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis. When the world's attention was divided on Cuba, China attacked us because they knew they wouldn't bother about a smaller sideshow. So that was 62. We had the book covers it. After that, I also bring out what the Henderson-Brooks report talked about based on various media reports. And the Henderson-Brooks report is not a report on the political establishment. The Henderson-Brooks report is about how we went militarily wrong and we should make military correction. But the political establishment felt that if we control that report and keep it hidden, then people will not read the report and draw assumptions that Panditji and Krishna Menon and others were responsible for the debate. But by 67, as Prabal's book brings out, we were a different army. We had got a wake-up call. We stood up to the Pakistanis in 1965. And interestingly, just after the 62 debacle, the Chinese signed a deal with Pakistan for the Shaksgam Valley, which is north of Siachen and J&K, which has got the largest collection of glaciers in the world, 242, because they want to melt the glaciers and get waters out of them. And the water is going to allow them to make microchips eventually. Because what happens is 10,000 liters of static water mixed with chemicals and sands. And north of Kashmir, there's a big desert called the Taklamakan Desert. Mix that with the waters of Indus and the dams out there and chemicals. And you create, every 10,000 liters, you create a 30 centimeter square silicon wafer block. And that makes many, many nano-sized microchips. And that is what goes into your phones and satellites, everything. So China has got an agenda for it from the 60s. हम तो इसी में लगे रहे, as some general said, कि we are just counting the crows on the hilltops and the treetops. We are not even looking at the stars. The China was working on it. So Pakistan and China signed a deal in 1963 after a humiliation in 62 for the Shaksgam Valley secession to China. It's 5,000 square kilometers. And China has got it. You're not going to get it back. Whatever the claims of our chest-thumping jingoists. Next, we have a situation in 67 where we gave them a bloody nose under General Sagat Singh. I believe something close to about 340 casualties took place. China didn't admit to all of that. China said 65 casualties, but at least they admitted to casualties. So China became quiet for 20 years after that. And then in 86, 87, they again intruded into what is, show the map again, please, into what is the area called Somdorong-chu. Somdorong-chu is near Namka-chu in the McMahon Line area, where again China did its salami slicing and came in, tried to say, ki humne occupy kar liya. So you see where Somdorong-chu is written. So whatever we grab, we will keep. We had a very bright and capable army chief then, General Sundarji. He said, to hell with you. And he had a tough corps commander there and some brigade commanders. And he said, fly in troops by helicopters and put them all around. So when Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi got to know about it, it was on the Navy Day Tea Party on 4th of Jan. And he asked for a meeting of the cabinet and the security establishment after tea in South Block. And he asked General Sundarji, he said, General, what have you done? And Sundarji said, Prime Minister, and Sundarji has told me this in as many words. In one evening I spent with him in Washington in 95 when I left the army. He says, Prime Minister, I have done what has been mandated to me by the cabinet resolution. And he said, what is that? He says, to defend every piece of Indian territory. So he says, what should be our policy to China? This is the Prime Minister of India asking. So Sundarji kept quiet. So a voice, trouble, no disrespect meant to you, with a distinct Bengali accent said, Madam's policy was that don't upset the Chinese. So Rajiv mimicked this gentleman who had had a long-standing tenure in various cabinets. Where did Madam get this policy from? So he said, from Panditji. So the matter ended there. And Rajiv Gandhi said, so that will be our policy. So Sundarji said, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, Prime Minister, in that case, you'll have to look for another professional opinion. I've done my job. I'm not going to ask the troops to withdraw. He saluted him and said, that's all I have to say. Luckily for Rajiv Gandhi, next day the Chinese withdrew. Because Chinese understand your ability to stand up to them. And then, of course, Prime Minister Gandhi was invited to a red carpet talks by Deng Xiaoping and started the whole sets of dialogues, which 24 rounds of special representative talks today has led to nothing. I say often on television that all they do in these talks is have chow mein and do sightseeing in Beijing. So what can we expect? Where are we at? And this is where I come to Galwan and thereafter. See, if China tries to push us militarily, we are not the army of 62. I have a chapter in my book which says 2020 was not 1962. We will hold them off at every inch where we are holding. It is for the government to decide whether we want to hold them off. But I know even if the government asks the army to pull back, it will not pull back. Just like successive governments have tried to suggest that the army pull back from the Siachen Glacier. And I'm proud that some army chiefs, at least in public, have said, give us ironclad guarantees. Sign the damn map on the actual ground position line that cuts through Siachen, where we are sitting in all the high heights. And the glacier lies behind us, not inside Pakistan. वो तो 10 किलोमीटर दूर में जाके किसी और ग्लेशियर में उनके जर्नलिस्ट को कैमरा से पीस टू कैमरा कराते हैं, हम सियाचिन में खड़े हैं. अरे आप पहुंचे ही नहीं तो कैसे खड़े हो? That is the truth. I've been there, I've spent time there. So we have to be very clear. Can we confront the Chinese militarily today? Yes. There are issues. We are building our infrastructure. And after the Somdorong-chu standoff, one wake-up call to the Ministry of Defense was that we start building our infrastructure so that we are able to have better positions, better logistic support, better communication systems for our troops to defend India. You know, strangely, from the 60s to the 90s, there was a damn view in South Block that if you make roads from Himalayan borders down to India's towns in the plains, you will make the Chinese easily come down on India. So don't make roads. Such are the stupid idiots who have been responsible for India's national security policy. They don't read books. They don't understand strategic situations. And I'm sorry to say that recently we gained an advantage against the Chinese on the Kailash ranges when our special forces went and occupied that, and the Chinese didn't know where to look. They were in panic in Galwan when we occupied. And हमारे महारथियों ने वापस दे दिया कि हम उनके साथ डिसएंगेजमेंट करेंगे और हम उनके साथ बातचीत करें. तो ये जो ऐलान है ना कि कोई भी टेरिटरी भारत की चाइना की कब्जे में नहीं है और हमारी टेरिटरी में नहीं है, अगर नहीं है तो आपने गलवान में क्यों लड़ाई लड़ी? आपका क्यों चाइना के साथ टेंशन है? Let us pull back the troops from there. Additional 50,000-60,000 troops are there. Why are you deploying them if your territories are not threatened? So we mislead people with wrong statements. The wrong statements are put into the mouths of our political leaders by our establishment, and the biggest culprit is the Ministry of External Affairs, who love to wax eloquent with a glass of wine in their hand wearing silk ties. But diplomacy today is about dirtying your knees and dirtying your elbows. You're not willing to do that, then don't take on that responsibility. So that, in short, I've taken 45 minutes, but that is my story, which is in this book. I'm happy to be court-martialed and asked questions. Whatever you wish to ask, I will tell you the truth and only the truth as I know it.
Thank you, sir. This has been a very engaging, riveting session. You have encapsulated the book in last 40-45 minutes in a very engaging manner, and I think that moves chronologically from the start to the present. And a lot of what we are seeing today lies in the genesis of what happened in the past. The two countries, they've run parallel histories. 1947, India got independence. 1949 was the beginning of a new China. The genesis, however, has been different. One talks about freedom from imperialism as a goal. The other talks about rehabilitation of its pride. And you have written in the book in terms of how one has, been focused on idealism and the other one on realism. Where do you think, and you've spoken about the 1940s and 50s, which culminated in the disaster or debacle of 1962. There are several instances that you write about. Which do you think would be a turning point? Say, for instance, India's rebuff of the American offer to join an alliance. Was that the biggest one, or is it a combination of several ones? Tibet being at the heart of the issue, China was focused on Tibet. We did not understand it. We didn't try to understand it. But where do you think was the nub of the issue that led to the whole thing ballooning to where we reached in 1962?
Well, the first was that China was given to believe that we didn't have a stomach for confrontation. So, this whole approach of appeasing the Chinese, of the Panchsheel agreement, and even as we know, Zhou Enlai came to India. Even then, he made a proposal, what is called the 5960 agreement, and it's the sum of the agreement is given in my book. Briefly, he said, you keep what you keep, we keep what we keep. And the uncontested or the unoccupied areas, let us have discussions on that. I mean, Panditji was more wanting to do hospitality with him, just like Panditji in his visits to China was not really wanting to talk to Mao about the border issue. And that was the border issue was at the heart of Mao's agenda. But Mao said, agar baat nahi karna chahte hain, to rehne do, keep it on the side. And Panditji kept it on the side. So the agreement could have been reached even before the conflict. One. Second, while saying that we'll not be in the American camp, it's a kind of situation, I wrote a piece in Tribune 2 years ago that 1962 déjà vu after Galwan, in which, you are again engaging very deeply with the Americans. But you're not exactly an American ally. You were not then in 62, you're not then now. But the more you engage with America, the more it gets China's back up. You were allowing American special forces to do operations and do airdrops via India. And some of them were overflights that took place from East Pakistan over Indian territory, going to drop paratroopers and Tibetan trained Khampa rebels in there and create mayhem for the Chinese. You were providing all sorts of support to the Tibetan Dalai Lama. And Dalai Lama was not in Lhasa for some time before he exited Tibet, because the Chinese had rolled into Lhasa and they were trying to capture him, but his followers made him escape. So he was floating around in the Tibetan plateau and you were trying to allow his coming in. And strangely, when Dalai Lama arrived in Indian territory near Kurseong on 30th March 1959, Panditji said that he wasn't aware of what was happening. But other side, he was micromanaging the entire foreign ministry. Who received him? MP Menon. I think the father of Shiv Shankar Menon or close relative of Mr. Shiv Shankar Menon, later FS and NSA. So the ME was in picture. So they had their man receive the Dalai Lama when he arrived. So the support we gave to the Tibetan, and this was 59, the war happened 2.5 years later in 62. So this obviously got again China's backup. Fine, we took a moral position that we are not allowing him to make political engagements, but we are giving him refuge in India, which has been the case now. But the Chinese don't go much for all this double talk, right? Thirdly, the so-called forward policy, which had our troops taking positions beyond the Thagla Ridge in Arunachal and north of Arunachal, and beyond our given positions in closer to Chinese occupied regions in Aksai Chin. So all this made China unhappy or nervous, or call it what you mean. I think these were broadly the three reasons that China said that enough is enough. And of course, Pandit Nehru's growing international stature. After the Bandung Conference of Non-Alignment, he became the great leader of the non-aligned world. And Mao Zedong obviously wanted to teach him a lesson or to bring him down to Mother Earth. So I would say these four factors were clearly on Chinese mind, and are probing air photography of the Lopnor facilities, which put China's nuclear program in the eyes of America. And China felt if America has such close links with India, they will use Indian air bases to refuel and then one day hit us and destroy our entire nuclear program. So those were the issues.
Right. And in fact, you spoke about Lopnor. In the 1960s, there was a mountaineering expedition led by Captain M.S. Kohli, which had taken the transmitter up there to understand whether the Chinese nuclear preparations could be monitored. And this was just before, I think, before the Americans lost interest here after the arrival of President Johnson. Lyndon Johnson came in, and the CIA virtually went away from here, and the Tibetan movement also started to collapse. But one of the points which I read in the book again, which is significant, given that Tibet, and you bring it out in your book, that Tibet gained independence in 1314, and till 1950 or 49, when China, the communist government took charge in China, Tibet had no status. And for 36 years or 35 years, it wasn't able to get the status of a nation. And I think one of the countries you mentioned, El Salvador, had raised the Tibetan issue, and yet it's incredible that for 35 years, India did not raise the issue. India did not, push the issue of Tibet being recognized as an independent nation or an entity. Just switching from that period to 1962, which you dealt about in your talk today and in the book, you ask a very pertinent, seemingly easy but a tricky question. Would the outcome have been different if General Biji Kaul, and then Nehru, Menon, Kotri wasn't taking the decisions? You've asked that. Let me just maybe that's again a question that I would ask. But the other thing more, which is a more detailed one, is: do you see 1962 as an inflection point? Because it is only after that, you mentioned 1967 and Sumdurungchu and the subsequent standoffs with China that have happened over the years. But we have always seen, up until 62, we were the second best, and of course we were bested in 62 because of all the decisions at a higher level which had happened before that. But do you see 62 as an inflection point, just to flip it and see that, look, this is where things started to change? And you briefly talk about the change of hands, the arrival of defense minister in 1964, Chavan, I think. And I think all of that changed with the 1965 India-Pakistan war. But just briefly, how would you look at it from that
Yeah,
point of view?
well, there are 3 points. The first is, if Tibet was independent for about 35 years, what is the problem in announcing Tibet as a nation and recognizing it as a nation? I think, again, Panditji faltered there, but also the world. The British came up with a concept of suzerainty to substitute the arguments of sovereignty. So they said, well, there was Tibetan suzerainty over their territories, but America and the others were looking for a British lead on the subject. And, Britain was at that time a very important nation. And the British were looking to see which side India would go on the subject. So because India didn't take a stand, Britain didn't take a stand, so America didn't take a stand, and, Tibet lost out. Because if Tibet was a recognized nation, then China's occupation of Tibet at that time would have had implications for China that would have had to answer even now. China was not then a member of the UN Security Council. There's another blunder that Panditji made, is to give China the seat that was being offered to India for the Security Council. So we continue to sit in the General Assembly and sometimes get elevated to the UN Security Council on a temporary 2-year tenure, as we are right now. Otherwise, our basic position is sitting beside Mauritius, Seychelles, Fiji Islands, and Papua New Guinea, because they're all members of the UN, and so are we. Big deal. Only our diplomats like the idea because it gives them fancy UN postings and post-retirement careers. But anyway, the UN be damned. I don't have much time for it. Now we come to 62. Was it an inflection point? Of course. And could we have done better with a different leadership? Well, even if that then existing military leadership made some minor changes, we would have survived the debacle. If Krishna Menon and Nehru kept away from micromanaging the battle, and as Brigadier Dalvi has written in his book, The Himalayan Baranda, that, it was worse than the charge of the Light Brigade. And we had the fall of, brigades, 7 brigade led by Brigadier Dalvi, were being ordered from Delhi when people didn't even know where the Thagla Ridge was. So there was a complete abdication of responsibility by military commanders. General Thapar, who cried apparently after the defeat, what good was his tears? General Bogi Sen, what good was his DSO in World War II in Burma if he didn't have the guts to stand up to Krishna Menon? And what good was it that others were put in out there, including General Pathania, who was later put in as GOC 4-day, sending a postcard to Nehru that gave me a chance to fight as a soldier once again to redeem my reputation, because he was also a military cross from Second World War. His son also rose to be a major general. Right? So these are people who should have been removed. You know how the army works. You know what happened in Kargil when that cartoon brigadier of 102 Brigade, was it 102 Brigade or whatever, say, floating around near the Mushko Valley saying that I've written to the chief. What business do you have to write to the chief when you have a GOC and a corps commander and an army commander on top of you? Why are you bypassing the chain of command? He was sidestepped, and there was an inquiry ordered to see whether his mental health was okay or not. That's how the army works. The army doesn't work by saying, कि साहब सरकार ने बोला. अभी भी that culture continues to prevail in South Block. That get a bloody bureaucrat to write a small note to say that no officer below 20 years service will be considered as a retiree, as me. And you have Lieutenant General sending letters to me of apologies to say that's a policy I cannot overrule. Then leave your bloody rank and go home. But that was the problem then, that is the problem now. And yes, were there changes? There were some changes. As one general once told me, that we began to change from a ceremonial army to a professional army. Before that, there was a lot of emphasis on spit and polish and parades and how your quarter guard looked as against how your training team looked. But things have changed. Things have changed. We are today a solid professional army, and I'm very, very certain, I can bet my bloody life's reputation on it. Nobody on earth can take away any Indian territory if it's left to the army. If it's left to a political leadership, that's a matter of a separate debate. And finally, what is it that we can, another question was about, did it show results in 65 or not? Of course it showed results. The good thing in 65 was that I've done an interview with Marshal of the Air Force, then Air Chief Marshal Arjun Singh, and he was the man who alerted Sri Y.V. Chavan about the Chinese, Pakistani intrusions in J&K. And Chavan Sahab said that get on with it and prepare for war, I'll handle the cabinet. And that changed the situation. We won that war, but for the lethargy on the part of South Bloc to declare it was an Indian victory, it was at best a draw. But we gained more territory, knocked off more tanks, more aircrafts, and killed more Pakistanis than they did. I don't know how they call it a victory. Because Ayub Khan basically set out to do a victory. And when he found nothing was happening on the Punjab front, thanks to the fight back put up by, in places like Hemkaran and Philora, and Abdul Hamid got his Paramvir Chakra there, that the Pakistan army ran to protect Lahore and Sialkot. Our troops reached Sialkot before them, but they didn't have orders what to do, so they just waited. And when you wait, they came back and they took it back and they said, oh, we defended Sialkot and Lahore. And the Soviet Union, by the way, let us down in the 65 talks in Tashkent, right? They promised us we'll go back to status quo ante, but we did not. And therefore, the confusion remained into what were our claims and their claims. But today, I think the solution lies in accepting as is where is solution, which means it may hurt a lot of people's sensibilities that मेरा खाली सवाल ये है, अगर वो आपकी टेरिटरी अक्साई चीन है, तो आप में से कौन अक्साई चीन के ऊपर से उड़ा है in a flight over the last 70 years? If it's not your territory, you can't fly over it, or the enemy will not let you fly over it. So therefore, claims over Aksai Chin, I feel, are based on complicated historical claims. Sometimes we claimed up to the Johnson line, as we've shown on the map. Sometimes they accepted the Johnson line, but borders should run around geographical features and watershed lines, or what you grab is for you to keep. Will you accept a settlement over it or not? We have to do a little soul searching. If we want the problem to continue in eternity, who suffers? The poor soldier. He sits in the bloody cold and freezes out there because nobody in Delhi has the guts to take a decision.
Since 2013, there have been more standoffs than in the 4 decades before. And, we've also seen it's also been a result of Xi Jinping ascending to power.
Yeah.
2015, China released a white paper to make it to have a superpower navy by 2030. And China has a 100-year plan from 1949, very clear that by 2049, China would want to be the biggest power on earth and the center of the earth, the Tianxia concept which they had from the 15th century. Xi Jinping seems to have advanced Chinese plans. And I'm just, bringing the dial to a more contemporary question. How do you see, and where do you see the future of India-China disputes right now? Does contested lands or the contested lands that we talk about in your book become contested areas of influence, which includes other satellite countries in the region, the neighborhood influence, the gray zone warfare, or the unrestricted warfare, as the Chinese call it? it's the Indian Ocean, the Indo-Pacific. Do you see that the areas of contestation or contested influences extend to places far beyond the borders, given that both India and China have ambitions? China has ambitions of being a global superpower. India wants to become an influential power in the region. Do you see that changing the grounds of or areas where the two powers will have more points of contestation?
Well, the first thing is China works to a plan. There is an interesting book by Ambassador Gokhale, former foreign secretary, which he calls The Long Game, that how China negotiates with you. It also explains how the Chinese establishment works, which means that it's like an octopus. That's what he says. There is a big head on top, which is managed by the Communist Party and Chinese leadership. And beyond that, there are arms of the octopus. So there's the Chinese Armed Forces, the PLA Navy, PLA Air Force, the Foreign Office, the intelligence agencies, the Finance Ministry, everybody else. And these are people who look for directions from the central leadership. The central leadership had made out a Vision 2050. Why? Because in 1949, the Communist Party came into being and the communist rule led by Mao Zedong created modern-day China. Some would have argued that in 1920, the Communist Party came into being in Shanghai, and therefore in 2020, China wanted to also establish its right over all disputed territories, and hence Galwan Effort. Apart from the fact that China always exploits a global situation, and the pandemic was to China's advantage, I have written an article on 3rd April 2020 in the Open magazine, where I've argued that the virus came from a lab and it was let loose on the world by design by China and some people in America who wanted the prices of vaccinations to go up so that America's drug industry bounces back and China is able to take control over all small and medium-sized businesses and economies all over the world. Because it's the damn West that has made China so rich over the years in the hope that China being rich would then become like any rich Western democracy. But obviously they get everything wrong, as I argue that Washington has more think tanks than the British Army has tanks, but they still get every assessment wrong. And so it has clearly happened in the case of China, it's happened again in the case of Ukraine and Russia. So best not to take American assessments too seriously. But what you can take seriously is some intelligence inputs that come from America because they have a vast intelligence network. Now, what is China going to do? You see, we have 2-3 levels of dispute with China. One is a territorial dispute. And this book is largely about the territorial dispute. Then there is a geostrategic dispute with China in our areas of strategic influence. What is our area of strategic influence? I would argue it is from the coast of Africa to the Straits of Malacca. So therefore, all the area in that area, we cannot control it, but it's an area of strategic importance to us and obviously an area of strategic influence. 3. So in this point itself, your question, very valid question, we should work harder to create our pockets of influence, but like fools, again, our great mandarins in South Block have advised successive prime ministers to keep investing in Afghanistan because wo hamare purane dost hain. So you put $2 billion there. And had you put the $2 billion in your neighborhood, $1 billion in Nepal, or $1 billion in Bangladesh and half a billion in Nepal and Sri Lanka, you would have them eating out of your hands. But you're trying to win them over because we have old historic religious ties with them. Yeah, all that doesn't matter. in geopolitics and diplomacy, your enemy's enemy is your friend. It's a thumb rule. China is now dominating 75% or more of Bangladesh's defense requirements. Nepal was getting lured into a $500 million American package for their water systems and dams and everything. And yes, there was a big sort of Nepalese movement, Nepalese pride, and said, we can't give in to Americans. But it's an amount of money that you can happily get the Nepalese at least to tell the Chinese that we don't want any extra pact with you. We'll just develop Nepal. And China may or may not develop, but if you do more development there, then your chances of winning brownie points are more than only having these Madeshis stand up and contest the Nepalese constitution. Yes, the constitution is lopsided, no doubt. Sri Lanka, the Rajapaksa brothers have sold the countries to the Chinese, whether it is Hambantota port or now parts of Colombo port. You are trying to win over by giving them some housing in Tamil areas and whatever else. The fact is that your core interest is your neighborhood. You can't buy out Pakistan. But America could have bought out Pakistan. I raised this point in a seminar in London 10 years ago. I was moderating a session which was by Stephen Cohen, the eminent Stephen Cohen, who's no more, Mr. Parthasarathi, India's ambassador to Pakistan, and Malia Lodhi was Pakistan's ambassador to London and Washington. And I said to Stephen Cohen, I said, before we open it up to the audience, Professor Cohen, I want to exercise the moderator's privilege and ask you a simple question. After 9/11, did you go into a wrong country? So obviously the audience started sniggering. What I basically was asking, that you went into Afghanistan partly because it was a winnable war, you thought. Partly because you created the Al-Qaeda, so you knew where the problem lay. But partly because you didn't want to confront Pakistan, which was really the patron of the Al-Qaedas now. So you didn't have to fight them. If instead of spending 600 million then, and now over $1 billion now, I asked him 10 years ago, you had given 60 billion to Pakistan army because you spent 600 billion there. Give 10% to the Pakistan army. You would have given them more than what China has given them to buy them out. And they would have happily sent their soldiers to go and fight with the Al-Qaeda there as they send later on, or the Taliban later. So, we don't do a dispassionate analysis of things. That's the bloody problem in South Block. Everyone gets taken over by emotion. How can we abandon them? Purane rishte. Yeah, the world keeps changing. I told the Pakistanis so many times on television shows. I said, you've been taken, you become a Pakistan ally, you have been dumped by them thrice. You'll again go back. Abhi to Imran Khan pahuncha hua hai Russia and he's gone to Beijing also. After some time, they will, when things dry out, the coffers dry out, they'll again go back to Washington. So, and you would have seen a lot of them with you in the university when you were studying there. So the Pakis are all over the place. I'll tell you, there are two things Pakistan invests in. If we invested in that, we'd be a great power. The military and the quality of our diplomats. Economy will come by and by. Today, the world fears Russia. They keep saying economy is weak. But Russia can feed itself. You might not agree with me because I know you would have some views about American foreign policy having studied in the US. But let me tell you, Russia has seen, I'm digressing a bit, both in Georgia and in Crimea, announcements of sanctions don't hold for beyond a point of time. The world has to get back to business as usual.
That's very interesting and very hard hitting its way. And I agree with you that, over a period of time, realpolitik in a sense, insofar as the US is concerned, has been a deterrent in terms of their interests and how they have progressed, how they have, especially now, that hasn't worked to their favor in the last few years. Sorry,
I just wanted to make another point, and that was a response to your third part of the question. Right. So what kind of warfare are we going to face with Chinese? On territorial front, we are okay. We can hold our own in Himalayas and in the high seas. In the geostrategic front, we have to pull out money to put in our neighbors because it's all cash deals at the end of the day. Internally, we have to be prepared against what you talked about, unrestricted warfare, which is really on three fronts. China buys out small and medium enterprises which are weak, which are collapsing. Apart from that, China buys out NGOs and left-leaning communists who will make anti-government noises. And thirdly, they then target your political leadership. I'm reading a very interesting book by a US Brigadier General. Keep forgetting the title. You know what he says? That when Mr. Biden was vice president, he went to China for some talks. Air Force 2, that's what the vice president flies in. Air Force 1 is for the president. With him went his son. So while Biden was doing a deal with the Chinese to try and bring down some kind of trading arrangements with the Russians, with the Chinese in a way that America and China would, continue to prosper without harming each other's interests. And by the way, the current American sanctions are also put out in such a way that America-China business interest doesn't get hurt. Right? With Biden was his son. He was doing business deals on the side on Air Force 2. He came back, and a week later, Biden's son's company received a $1 billion Chinese investment. So this Brigadier General, who'd been American Defense Attaché in Beijing, has worked with the National Security Council in the US, has worked in White House, has worked in think tanks. He has a PhD also. And he says China is all over the American establishment, all over the thing. In fact, he brought out that in Trump's time, the labor and later the trade secretary was a lady who was married to a congressman who was pro-Trump. But her father was a very close friend of Chinese President Hu Jintao. And therefore, she was passing orders to make Americans unemployed so that Chinese business would prosper in America. And it's happening in front of everyone's nose. And in America, they can't prevent it. So I would say, let's beware of that in India. Abhi tak to nahi hua hai, but if we get signs of it, let's put our foot down, because that is how China will take you over and keep you only deflected on the territories. They will take your society over from giving you cheap Chinese products, whether it is cell phones or the statues of gods. Everything is made in China.
Thank you, sir. That's a great point. In fact, just to add to your point, this approach has been there since the 1960s. It's just that they didn't have the wherewithal at that point of time. The changing the narrative, redefining or trying to coax others to believe in what they've been doing. Francois Mitterrand, later on to become the French president, was visiting China in late 1950s. And at that point of time, or I think it was early 1960s, he was taken around China. And he, after he ended his tour, he went back to France and he told them how the West was completely wrong about communist China and how people were very happy out there. So he did that. Mao and Zhao did that with Labour MPs in UK as well. So they would get these Western politicians to China, brainwash them, and then send them back to become their ambassadors. Today, with the social media and all else, China invests 10 billion every year into the social narrative or changing the social narrative, and also investing in several other aspects, such as you mentioned, the stakeholders of various companies, etc., which is where they intend to impact the world and sort of, and they've, over a period of time, they've also dismantled the international institutions, as we've seen with WHO and some of the others. So I don't think we would have much time, sir, but if there is anything else that you'd like to add.
I said so earlier that China is working to a plan. We are not. And therefore, we have to have, and I've said this to the National Security Advisor also, that I said, sir, we need to have a plan which is what you call strategic communication plan, or we can, have a plan on how we can actually put across our messaging. Our biggest strength is the Indian diaspora. We are not exploiting them enough. I give lectures on military media communication or national security communication. I'm giving one at the USI on Friday. And I always argue that, we're down to tera mera and turf battles even internally. That if you're in the government, you can be trusted with your opinion on issues of sensitivity or national security. And for anybody else to be trusted to give an opinion, I have made films in the past. The MI and other areas have looked at it, and they nitpick about one word here and one word there. Just like I was recording the other day in a studio, and one studio guy came to me and said, "Ki sir, aapke piche se jo hai na, wo zara mic ka taar dikh raha hai." मैंने कहा, अगर जो आदमी मेरे माइक का तार ही देखेगा ना, तो वो बेवकूफ है. तुम उस ऑडियंस को अगर खुश करना चाह रहे हो, कि क्या तुम उसको खुश करना चाह रहे हो कि जो समझने की कोशिश कर. But that Charlie has been employed to do that only. Na? So the problem is that there are a lot of people whose job depends on, यार तुमने मारूफ रजा की स्क्रिप्ट देखी और उसमें तुमने ये नहीं देखा, तो उसने पीओके नहीं बोला, उसने बोला the erstwhile Jammu and Kashmir. हम उसी में लगे हुए हैं. That's what, when I gave the infantry lecture some years ago, one general said to me, he says, ex-DGMO, I won't take his name, and he said to me, he says, we are just killing crows. You explain to us the big picture in Kashmir, that why should we be there in the first place and what is at stake? And all credit to the good soul of General Bipin Rawat, the late General Bipin Rawat. He read my book on Kashmir and he organized for me to give the infantry lecture. So when I met General Rawat, I said, sir, why me? I'm nobody. He said, no. I had always wanted to have one lecture by you before I retired. And there were 350 people who listened in. And the feedback was positive. Some of them didn't give any response, including senior generals, because they're too shocked. All the paradigms they had lived with all the years, that Kashmir hamara hai because it is said hamara hai. They found it difficult to accept that there is a bigger British game that was played out, where the British wanted to have total control over Kashmir, not India or Pakistan. And Kashmir came to us because of default. Because the Maharaja of Kashmir, he panicked, he left Kashmir and came to Jammu with 90 truckloads of goodies. And what did he say? We've lost Kashmir. There are many nationalist people who now say, बड़े महान थे, वो कश्मीर भारत में लाए थे. अरे यार, वो कश्मीर छोड़ के भाग गए थे. वो तो भारतीय सेना ने कश्मीर को पकड़ के रखा है. Left to even the bloody Abdullahs, Kashmir would have gone long ago. But I'm digressing. But Kashmir is linked to the China issue, by the way. Okay.
Yes.
China's involvement in Aksai Chin has a geostrategic implication for Kashmir. It has a geostrategic implication for Siachen. Siachen is a battle that Pakistan is fighting for us on behest of China. I'm giving a talk on this at IISS in London in May. But I'm going to explain to the white audience, ki boss, this is the problem of your creation. हम झेल रहे हैं उसको.
Right. In fact, 1965, as way back in 1965, China had participated in egging on Pakistan, as in terms of their plan on Kashmir and China's plan on Sikkim. So it goes back to that time of 1965, and I think it's after the 1963 agreement that happened between China and Pakistan that China started to take interest in Kashmir, because it sort of suited them geographically that Pakistan has an interest there. So yes, it goes back way back to 1965, and it's
only after 63 the China-Pakistan relations began to firm up, because until then China looked at Pakistan with suspicion as a US ally.
Right.
Remember, the US had a strong linkage with Pakistan, and Pakistan became part of the Seato-CENTO alliances in the 50s. And it was Pakistan's relationship with the US and with China that it was able to get Henry Kissinger to go to China in 1971. That started what came to be known as ping pong diplomacy.
Correct.
And led to US, China, Nixon, Mao meet. And that led to US, China hopes of support to Pakistan in the 71 war. That in turn led Mrs. Gandhi in August 71 to do an arrangement with the Russians, which gave us that window to take over East Pakistan because of the delays in the UN Security Council resolution.
That's right. That's right. And in fact, in 1959-60, Ayub Khan, then president of Pakistan, had taken a flight over India, and he stopped over in Delhi. And there was a dispute between China and Pakistan that was going on at that point of time. And Pakistan hadn't cozied up to China during that period. So Ayub Khan wanted to have a joint front against China, and he wanted India and Pakistan to have a joint front against China. And this was 1959-60, and things started to change thereafter. I think he's
and Panditji responded, joint defense against what? This is in my earlier book on Kashmir, Wars and No Peace Over Kashmir, that I wrote in 95. This illusion that was there. Apparently, people say that Panditji was such a giant that nobody could contest him. Interestingly, after Panditji passed away, I've said that in my book, and our Foreign Secretary of India has admitted that to me. I have his email admitting that when the Chinese again offered us post-62 an arrangement that let's settle Aksai Chin with what we have, what you have, and McMahon line in any way is a given in India's favor. Mr. Parthasarathi, who is not the current Parthasarathi that you see on TV, but another Parthasarathi, who was also secretary in the MEA, he dismissed the suggestion by saying we'll be being disloyal to Nehru's legacy. Ye problem hai. MEA is still carrying the baggage of Nehru. I said that in my book discussion at the IIC, when a lot of former ambassadors came there, and a former ambassador also did the discussion on my book, Ambassador Chenoy, who's director IDSA. I said, the problem with all of you is you can't get over Nehru here. And because of that, we can't solve the Chinese problem. अब ये है कि साहब मैं वो जमीन का टुकड़ा उन्हें नहीं दूंगा क्योंकि पिताजी ने कहा था कि वो जमीन परसों से हमारी चली आ रही, तो हम वो जमीन नहीं देंगे, तो फिर आप आगे ही नहीं बढ़ सकते.
That's true. I think the legacy has continued to play in the minds of diplomats, and you've said somewhere in the book that it is the problem has been with the politico-bureaucratic elite that has continued to falter at different stages. We've had joint working groups in the 80s, and then we've had several rounds of discussions in 93, 96, 2005, 2000, and all of that has taken place, that has led us nowhere, and yet we continue to falter and wander, waffle and move along. I think that is something that needs to change. You've mentioned declassification. That's something that I and it's linked to what you've been talking about. Why, over the years, and it's very important that historians write books about the era, about the history that's transpired in the last 60 or 100 odd years, because we haven't had an official history which is declassified, a declassified history which carries inputs from that time. And I think that is something that's still due. Though we have had official histories, but they have later were clarified to have not been as official as they were supposed to be by Mr. Prasad and then somebody else. So you've had histories written, released by the government, but they've not been declassified entirely. And especially one of those things that has happened that's kind of come to bite India was, which you briefly mentioned, 1970-71, Neville Maxwell's history. In the absence of us telling our history, Neville Maxwell's history carried more weight and thus swayed the US policy led by Henry Kissinger and Nixon on China. So your thoughts on declassification, and do you think that is something that we would be able to overcome in times to come?
See, the last part first. I don't think we'll overcome that very easily, because that is the nature of Indian bureaucracy. When I was studying in England at King's College, my head of department had to sign a letter every month to say that I'm around and I haven't run away and, disappeared into the English woods. And he used to say, why do you need this every month? I was then an army officer on study leave, by the way. And I said, we have to submit this report to army headquarters. He says, God, your bureaucracy is worse than ours. We learned it from the British, so we are worse than them. Second point, there have been reviews that have come out of my book, and at least 2 reviews written by former diplomats have both started the first paragraph raving about Madam Nirupama Rao's book on Sino-Indian relations 49 to 62. I have broadly just said that I have great respect for her, but is she saying something new? With all the information that she had access to as ambassador to China, as JSXP, as foreign secretary, and even ambassador to the US, what is it? I haven't read the book, but I want to raise a question. And that's in my book. I have given very clear a paragraph to that all important documents from Pandit Nehru's office between 49 and 62 was being passed on to the CIA. And there are 3 people who have said that, and I've given them in my footnote. Mr. Giri Dishankar, former diplomat and then head of the Institute of Chinese Studies. Ambassador Stobden, who has himself written a book on China, and he's written a foreword to my book. And Mr. Sarvapalli Gopal, head of the Indian Historical Section, biographer at Nehru, and later professor at St. Anthony's, Oxford. So मैं हवा में नहीं बोल रहा. Has Miss Rao said that? Or was that too sensitive for her to say? I just want to raise that one question. Now, the fact is declassification as a thumb rule. I must quote to you a little experience. Once, I love to visit museums. I think you also probably do. So once I was in Washington, I visited a museum called Newseum. That's the News Museum. And the 2 guys at the gate were 2 black guys. They looked at me. I'm also semi-black. So they asked me, they said, where are you from? I said, India. They said, oh, Amitabh Bachchan. So I said, yes, Amitabh Bachchan. They knew a couple of his films. These black guys who were the guys who were taking the ticket. So people know about India more than just you leave it to analysts. When I went inside, there's a map of the world, and that shows the level of freedom every country has in the American assessment of things. And we are seen as about 50% free. This will come as a shock to all Indians, because we are allowed to shoot off our mouth on most things, right? We have a free press, we have television, we have radio. And as Amartya Sen would argue, that we are an argumentative lot, argumentative Indians, his book. So why does the world think we are semi-free? Because we don't come out with information on subjects the world wants to know more about. We don't have a culture of declassification. The other day, I got a call from an officer in the Ministry of Defense, and he's a JNU PhD. He says, sir, I've been asked to write the history of these wars, compile it. So I need your help and all. So I said, अगर आपको बोला है लिखने के लिए तो आप लिखिए. कहता नहीं, sir, I've read all your books and all that stuff, we need your help. So I said, see, I am not willing to take on your responsibility. And you have to tell me how much of the truth are you willing to come out with. कहता वो तो मैं लिखूंगा, but then the authorities will decide what do we go to public with. So, as an officer said, as a major said in a SAN model discussion in Hisar in 1984 when I was with the mechanized forces, that he says, he told the GOC, he later himself became a GOC. He says, sir, battle history is that which is written after battles. What happens on the ground, only those who are there on the ground know. So, you don't get access to much information. You may have had access to the war diaries of 2nd Grenadiers and other units, 18 Rajputs and all that were there in Athula. But the fact of the matter is that we need to become transparent. But having said that, I would like to counter that point by saying, how much transparency is good? How much do you need to come out with to make a point? As long as you can have a half-decent narrative, and I can tell you something with a lot of pride and confidence. This book, which I sent copies across to the Foreign Secretary, the Army Chief, the NSA, and others, I got a really reassuring phone call from a colonel in the military operations. I'd given a copy to General Bipin Rawat also. He said, Maruf, मैं थोड़ा travel कर रहा हूँ, उसके बाद आके release कर दूंगा. But you know the rest. Sadly, he never came back. But his office passed this book on to military operations. And the General Rawat had said to me that I'll just get your maps and other things checked up if there are nothing that would cause an embarrassment to us. I said, fine, sir. So a colonel called me and he said, sir, I've read your book with interest. I've got your number. I don't give my number very easily. So he said, I got your number from the letter you'd written to General Rawat. And that letter somehow came to me because I'm handling the China part in military operations. And I can tell you, sir, there is nothing I can fault in the book. And you know how the military operations and military intelligence look at वो तो देख hair comb लेके देखते हैं एक word को कि कहाँ पे आपने कुछ ऐसा लिख दिया जिससे embarrassment नहीं हो जाए. Because the Chinese say that on one side you have General J.J. Singh, who on my TV show, former army chief, and also as DMO, has said that the border with China is close to 4,200 kilometers. But often the claim that India makes is of 3,488 kilometers.
Right.
So you first decide what length of the border you want. Then we'll talk. You know, China uses all these evasive tactics. The point I'm making is that if a book like this is reasonably accurate, and full marks to the Army Chief, General Naravne, I sent him a copy. Without getting back to me, I think he instructed ADGPI that ask all units to pick up a copy. So I get a call or 2 or 3 every day for some Havaldar or some Babuji. Ki sir, ye contested lands kahan se milegi? So then I got a standard message on my phone that I SMS to them ki ye public, मैंने वही किताब लिख दी, मैं publish नहीं किया. So I'll give you the publisher's name, etc. and number, you reach them. So I asked the public, we get calls every day from Army. They all want a copy of this. So at least to that extent, once MO is approved, the Army has decided to read it. It's better than not reading anything. And I think that's where the declassification story lies as far as I'm.
Please do read. This is an India-China book that will tell you and it's a quick read. It's a quick read, not because it's just it's a shorter book, but it's also because it's been lucidly written. And I would urge you to pick up the book.
You mentioned or talked about the Cuban Missile Crisis and the misadventurism of China at that point in time. And now here in 2022, we have this Ukraine crisis, and you really don't know where it would lead to. So do you foresee any misadventurism on part of China taking advantage of this situation? This was one question. And the second question was, how much of a void the untimely and sad demise of General Bipin Rawat has left as far as the modernization of Indian armed forces is concerned? Thank you so much.
Both are very good questions. And in both cases, I'll give you my opinion. I can't say that is the government of India's opinion. But I think the possibility of China exploiting what is the end outcome of Ukraine, because if the world is unable to come back with a comprehensive set of responses against Russia, though as Shiv Shankar Menon Sahab, our former foreign secretary and NSA, had argued the Indian position in 2014 to say Russia also has legitimate interests in Ukraine. So, India's position is pretty neutral, but we understand both sides of the story, and we don't get swayed by propaganda as America does. Interestingly, yesterday I was on a show with Rahul Shivshankar at 8 p.m. And after 8:30, there was a very eminent American journalist and a former American general. And I was surprised to see how strongly they are both divided over should America do more or is America responsible for the mess there is. Okay. So likewise, we cannot expect either America or anybody to hold our hand. Our guard should be up. And the window for China to do something, I would say, begins now with first Russia, Ukraine. And secondly, in March, they're going to have major military exercises. Is this exercise going to turn into another punch into India as Russia did with Belarus exercises? If so, how are we going to respond? I think we need to remain alert to that. I am told that our people have been bitten once. They are not going to be shy anymore. They're going to be ready for it. As far as General Rawat is concerned, I had the privilege of serving with him in Dehradun as instructors in IMA. And I developed an immense liking for the man who was very practical, very down to earth, very honest, and a fine soldier by all accounts. Prabal knows him better because he was Prabal's commanding officer. But I think his going away has certainly created a void. There are certain initiatives that he wanted to push through despite opposition from people in the service. And I'm shocked and ashamed to say that many ex-servicemen were rejoicing his going away. You know, it is a very sad reflection on the kind of beliefs and values these people hold. Whatever the man was doing, he was doing in national interest. The man deserved all the respect and accolades that are given to him. Had he stayed longer, he would have fulfilled many of the mandates that he had in mind. But having said that, the military is not short of talent. It is, and that's the point I made in 62 also, that the military was not short of talent. If BG Kaul was sacked after the first attack on Nathula, on Namkachu, and he came running back to Delhi and pretended to be sick. And can you imagine? He was commanding a bloody operating corps in Nifa, and war is on, and he's lying in his bed and trying to run a battle from his bed in Krishna Menon Marg. And there were ministers who were coming to pay respect to him. ये जनरल साहब को कोई मिनिस्टर उनकी मौत पे नहीं आता है यार, और उनके बेड पे आ रहे थे कि आप बताइए अब क्या होगा क्या? First sack the damn guy and put a capable chap in charge of it. Nobody else. Put General Umrao Singh in charge, who knew the area, who opposed Nehru's diktats and was shifted to Siliguri. He would have saved the day. So there are good people always in the military. You don't go up. I've always believed in the military. You can be misjudged by one rank and go up. अगर आप ब्रिगेडियर होने थे और घर जाना था, गलती से मेजर जनरल कोई बना देता है तो ठीक है, फौज आपको लेके कंधे पे चल पड़ती है। या अच्छा ब्रिगेडियर होता है तो हमारे एक सूबेदार साहब ने हमें बताया था कि साहब हमें एक कहावत होती है कि जो अफसर ब्रिगेडियर की रैंक के ऊपर चले गया उसने आत्मा का सौदा कर लिया, राइट? तो वो भी हालत हो सकती है कि आप ब्रिगेडियर हो के अपनी पैर लगाते हैं तो सब कहेंगे साहब आप घर चले जाइए, you're too much of an obstruction to the general narrative here. But there are good people available, capable people available. Why they are not appointing a new CDS as a replacement to General Rawat? There are many political issues. You see, in seniority is General Naravne. But if they appoint him, then Air Force, Navy हाथ खड़े कर देंगे कि साहब हर बार आप फौज का अपॉइंट करते हैं। भाई ये इत्तेफाक की बात है कि उनकी सीनियरिटी आ गई। दूसरी चीज ये है कि कैन जनरल नरावने be now given an extended tenure, or should you need to give it a new appointment, new face to somebody? They are all equally capable. At that rank, 19-20 का फर्क होता है. It's like saying which professor is better than the other in the department in the university. I can't say that for Indian universities, but I can certainly say that for foreign universities, that you become a professor, you are a pandit in your own area.
Would you like to give concluding remarks, Prabal sir?
Very grateful to Major Maruf Raza, who has, walked us through his book in terms of the salient points and also the highlights that we should, as Indian citizens who are aware of what's going on between India and China, need to understand and know better. Not because we are fond of history alone, but it is, and this issue continues to be a contemporary issue, and which, as Chaddaji also mentioned in his question, is also something that overlaps several global issues, the Ukraine issue, for instance, and several other issues in the past as well. So thank you, sir. Thank you for a wonderful talk. It's been a great session. And thanks, everyone, for organizing this.